You ever have that moment where everything you worked for goes up in smoke? Literally? There I was, sprinting down the dock, lungs burning, heart pounding, watching my pride and joy freedom, the sailboat I'd owned for 15 years, swallowed by flames. The fire wasn't just licking the fiberglass, it was devouring a chapter of my life, burning away dreams and memories faster than I could catch my breath. And there, standing in the shadows like the villain in a bad movie, was Veronica Grant, the HOA president, her face lit up not by concern, but by the satisfaction of someone who thinks she's won. But if she thought torching my boat would break me, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love hearing from folks who appreciate stories that don't just entertain but sting a little. Packed with twists, justice, and just the right amount of HOA chaos. And hey, if that sounds like your kind of story, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode, even more jaw-dropping. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Moving to Maplewood Cove Estates was supposed to be the peaceful chapter after years of legal battles and late nights grinding in the corporate world. I left all that chaos behind, trading contracts and courtrooms for quiet mornings and open water. Freedom wasn't just a boat. She was a trophy from a hard-fought victory representing everything I believed in: justice, resilience, and the simple pleasure of sailing on a calm lake. Yet, within months of arriving, the tranquility shattered. It started with petty complaints about the aesthetics of my boat. Little notes slipped under my door, accusing me of breaking invisible rules. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. After all, who could imagine that behind the manicured lawns and friendly smiles lurked a community that would weaponize its rules to crush anyone who didn't fit their mold? Then came the HOA meetings. The great theater of suburban control. Veronica commanded the room like a queen wielding her scepter, all perfectly coiffed hair and rehearsed charm that could cut deeper than any lawyer's cross-examination. The residents nodded along, fearful or perhaps just too polite to dissent. Stories floated about neighbors who tried to color their doors a forbidden shade or dared to put up a basketball hoop. Neighbors who vanished under a barrage of violation notices and relentless fines. I remember one couple whispering warnings in my kitchen, cautioning me to keep my head down. But you know what? Silence in Maplewood Cove was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. It didn't make the threats go away. It just made you easier to pick off. My first real hint that this wasn't just about community standards came when I found deep scratches etched into Freedom's hull, scars that told a story far more personal and violent than HOA bylaws ever could. Security footage caught Richard Collins, one of Veronica's cronies, prowling the dock in the dead of night, metallic glint in hand, an unwelcome echo of intimidation rather than neighborhood watch. When I confronted him, the excuse was as thin as the evening mist. Neighborhood kids, probably. But you and I both know how that goes. When the HOA's version of justice is kids with a grudge, you've already lost before the game begins. So here I was, standing on a dock that once promised freedom and now smelled of smoke and betrayal, realizing that the real battle wasn't about a boat or even an HOA's rules. It was about power. Who holds it, how they wield it, and what happens when that power gets twisted into something corrosive. Veronica didn't just want to keep her little kingdom tidy, she wanted to control every inch of it. And I was the inconvenient variable threatening to upset the balance. But if this was war, then consider me drafted, because sometimes, when they try to burn you down, the only thing left to do is rise from the ashes and fight back smarter, harder, and with a little more fire of your own. And I left the relentless grind of the legal world behind. I thought I was trading battles for calm seas. After 12 years of arguing cases in crowded courtrooms and burying myself in contracts that might as well have been written in Sanskrit, I finally had a win I could savor. My first novel deal. With that victory came freedom, my sailboat, a gleaming 32-foot reminder that hard work pays off. She wasn't just a boat, she was a trophy. The polished prize after a David versus Goliath fight against a ruthless landlord. I imagined lazy weekends gliding across Maplewood Cove's shimmering lake, pages of my manuscript in one hand, the wheel in the other. But sometimes peace doesn't arrive with trumpets and sunshine. Sometimes it creeps in like small ripples before a storm you never saw coming. Those ripples began subtly. At first, it was a note taped to my front door complaining that freedom didn't fit the classic aesthetic of the lake. A plain white hull, apparently, was a crime against community decorum. Then came more citations for the color of the fenders, the placement of my dock lines, even the style of the flag fluttering on the mast. Each note was more absurd than the last, like a string of increasingly ridiculous insults aimed at wearing me down. I thought, well, maybe it's just bureaucracy doing its thing, a small price to pay for quiet waters. But politeness was my shield, and it quickly proved as fragile as the fiberglass under a blowtorch. What I didn't realize then was that these tiny waves were actually warning signs, the first whispers of a targeted campaign that would flood every corner of my life. I tried to shake it off, telling myself this was just a neighborly squabble, a clash of personalities that didn't merit losing sleep. But that's when the real storm began brewing, the kind that doesn't announce itself with thunder, but with hushed conversations and sideways glances. At the first HOA meeting I attended, Veronica Grant was in full command, her presence as polished and sharp as the silver in her hair. She laid down the law with the finesse of a CEO, promising to keep property values high by making sure everyone plays by the rules. The problem was, the rules seemed designed to play me out, and as I sat there, I could feel the room tightening around me like a noose, polite nods from some, worried looks from others. There was a social hierarchy at work, and I was clearly at the bottom. Stories of neighbors who dared to challenge Veronica floated around like ghosts. The Palmers who wanted a blue door and ended up drowning in violations. The Johnsons, whose innocent basketball hoop dream was crushed under fees and studies that conveniently disappeared when they gave up. And then there were Greg and Sophia Wilson, my closest neighbors, who warned me in hushed tones to watch my step. Their words were heavy with the kind of fear you don't often hear in the land of backyard barbecues and lawn ornaments. I laughed nervously at first, chalking it up to neighborhood gossip, but every whispered warning added weight. It was becoming clear that silence and compliance weren't shields here. They were targets. And I was about to find out just how far the HOA would go to make me fall in line. Looking back, the first scratches on Freedom's hull were the opening salvo, a clear message written in fiberglass and fear. Watching the security footage later, I saw Richard Collins prowling the dock under the cover of darkness, his metallic glint catching the moonlight. When I called him out, his neighborhood kid's excuse hung in the air, flimsy as a torn sail in a stiff wind. But excuses don't fix scars, physical or otherwise, and they certainly don't stop a storm gathering strength. Every violation, every threat, every sneer was a wave pushing me closer to the edge, and while I wasn't about to let my boat become a casualty, I knew the fight was about so much more than a patch of dock space. It was about power, control, and the price of standing your ground in a community ruled by fear. When you think of HOA presidents, you might picture a kindly neighbor who loves community potlucks and enforces rules with a smile. Well, Maplewood Cove's version, Veronica Grant, wasn't that. She ruled like a queen with a silver crown perched perfectly atop her coiffed hair. But don't be fooled, beneath that polished exterior was an iron fist wrapped in velvet gloves. At the monthly HOA meetings, Veronica commanded the room effortlessly, her voice smooth as silk, but residents nodded along, smiles plastered like masks, while whispered fears floated just below the surface like hidden currents. You had to wonder, who watches the watchers when the watchers are this watchful? Veronica's reputation stretched far beyond her 7 years as HOA president. Neighbors told stories in hushed tones about those who dared to cross her path. The Palmers, who wanted to paint their front door a rebellious shade of blue, found themselves drowning in violation notices until they capitulated. The Johnsons, dreaming of a basketball hoop for their kids, were hit with a special assessment so mysteriously expensive it disappeared as quickly as their plans did. And then there was the elderly couple who installed a bird feeder, an act of innocent kindness, if you ask me, only to be forced out when Veronica declared the feeder inconsistent with community standards. These weren't just neighbors, they were cautionary tales, warnings carved into the fabric of the community, and I was about to become the next chapter. At my first HOA meeting, the theater of control was in full swing. Veronica sat at the head of the table like a chess master, plotting moves 7 steps ahead. Her closest allies, Richard Collins and Linda Ramirez, flanked her. Richard with a grin that never quite reached his eyes, Linda with a nervous twitch in her hand that said she'd rather be anywhere else. When Veronica spoke about maintaining property values and community standards, her words dripped with practiced grace, but the undertone was clear. Dissent would not be tolerated. I sat there, the outsider, feeling the weight of countless unspoken rules pressing down like a thick fog. It wasn't just about rules, it was about control. And if you didn't play along, you'd be left out in the cold. But even under such a shadow, there were flickers of resistance. Some residents avoided Veronica's gaze, but exchanged knowing looks with me, their silent messages louder than any words. Linda's eyes betrayed a mix of fear and regret every time she handed out violation notices she clearly didn't want to issue. And then there was Jennifer Clark, the local journalist quietly taking notes in the back row, a reminder that someone outside the cove was watching too. These small acts of defiance were like sparks waiting to ignite a fire, because in communities ruled by fear, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply speak the truth out loud, even when everyone else chooses silence. So here I was, caught between polished smiles and whispered warnings, trying to figure out how to navigate a place where conformity was currency and resistance was dangerous. Veronica was more than a HOA president. She was the queen of Maplewood Cove, a monarch whose kingdom was built on fear and whispered threats. But kingdoms built on silence and control don't last forever. As I learned more about her reign and the stories behind those quiet smiles, I knew one thing for sure. The next move was mine. And trust me, the game was far from over. If you found this story or the lessons within helpful, please send it to a friend who might be facing something similar, because none of us should have to face these battles alone. And hey, leave a comment and let me know what you think of this story so far. Your thoughts might just be the spark that helps someone else find their voice. Maplewood Cove's HOA had a knack for wrapping control in the sweetest sounding words. One day, out of the blue, they introduced a lake safety initiative. Sounds responsible, right? Well, not when the safety concerns suddenly meant Freedom's mast was 8 inches too tall and had to come down. It felt less like protecting residents and more like aiming a loaded cannon at me. Those HOA rules, they weren't innocent guidelines. They were snakes in the grass, ready to strike at anything that dared stand out. And my boat? Their favorite target. What really got under my skin was how these new rules popped up with no warning. No notice on the agenda, no community discussion, just surprise attacks disguised as preliminary discussions. When I called it out, quoting the bylaws about proper notice and procedure, I got a rehearsed smile and a lesson in Maplewood's flexibility. According to Veronica, flexibility meant changing the rules on a whim and pretending it's all for our safety. It was a bitter irony. Rules meant to protect safety were being wielded like weapons to strip away mine. Freedom, the very symbol of my hard-won victory and independence, was being suffocated by bureaucracy. Then came the escalation. One night, I came down to the dock and saw fresh, deep scratches along Freedom's hull. No accident, no playful kids, but deliberate vandalism. Security footage showed Richard Collins, Veronica's loyal henchman, prowling the marina well after midnight, a metallic glint catching the light. When I confronted him, he muttered something about neighborhood kids, but the excuse was as thin as a sail in a hurricane. It wasn't just harassment anymore, it was a declaration. Someone was trying to scare me off, and they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. The lake might look peaceful by day, but beneath the surface, dark currents were pulling hard. This wasn't just a fight about boat height or paint colors anymore. As I dug through the HOA's financial documents, cluttered, confusing, and suspicious, I found troubling gaps and unexplained deposits. Veronica's side hustle wasn't just maintaining order in the community. She owned a real estate development company with serious interests in the lakefront properties of Maplewood Cove. The Clean Lake Initiative, not about protecting the environment, it was a smokescreen for clearing out homeowners so luxury condos could rise. The little ripples I'd ignored were tidal waves headed straight for me. And suddenly the stakes weren't just about my boat, but about a whole community's future. Each violation notice piled up. Each new rule became another obstacle in a game I didn't ask to play. My days filled with fighting paperwork that felt like quicksand, dragging me deeper into this fight over control and power. But if there's one thing years in the courtroom taught me, it's that every rule, no matter how twisted, has a weakness. Justice finds its way through the cracks if you're smart enough to look. I didn't know yet how far this fight would reach or what I'd have to risk, but one thing was certain. Maplewood Cove was no longer just a quiet lakeside neighborhood. It was a battleground, and I was right in the middle of it. When I first met Jennifer Clark, the local investigative journalist, I didn't realize I'd just found the closest thing to an ally in Maplewood Cove. Jennifer wasn't your typical reporter. She had this knack for peeling back layers until the ugly truth squirmed out like a snake in the grass. She'd been tracking HOA abuses across the county for months, collecting stories that sounded like bad fiction but were painfully real. I wondered aloud, when did a neighbor become a predator? She didn't hesitate. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies wear smiles and hold committee titles. Working with Jennifer felt like stepping into a shadowy chess game where every move counted. But it was clear, this was bigger than just me or my boat. The deeper we dug, the darker it got. Veronica's financial footprint sprawled across a tangled web of shell companies and consulting firms, all perfectly legal on paper but crafted to funnel money into her real estate empire. What surprised me wasn't just the scale of her operation, but how methodical it was. Each violation seemed less about community standards and more about chipping away at property values, forcing owners like me to sell at a loss. Survey markers popped up around the lakefront, little orange flags, innocent at first glance, but really flags of conquest marking the ground for her next development deal. I began to see Veronica less as a community leader and more as a shadowy strategist, playing a long game with high stakes. But then Jennifer shared something unexpected, Veronica's personal story. Years ago, she lost her daughter in a tragic boating accident, and since then, the woman I'd come to loathe had been fighting her own demons. It was a reminder that even villains carry burdens we rarely see. Not that it excused her actions. If anything, it made them more chilling, a calculated armor built from grief and desperation. It's a complicated truth. Sometimes the fiercest predators are the most broken. This complexity didn't make me back down, it only sharpened my resolve. The stakes were no longer just about me, but about exposing a system that preyed on pain to feed power. Despite the grim revelations, the cracks in Veronica's armor gave us hope. Jennifer's reporting attracted quiet support from neighbors who had been too scared to speak up. Linda Ramirez, the HOA treasurer, started opening up about the pressure she'd faced, the veiled threats, the secret meetings, the way Veronica's influence seeped into every corner of the community. Her trembling hands signing off on dubious documents told a story of someone caught between loyalty and fear. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. Maplewood Cove was awakening, and for the first time, the silence began to break. Even the smallest voices can stir a storm when they rise together. So here I was, staring down a powerful foe who had turned a neighborhood into her playground and a lakefront into a gold mine. The chessboard was set, pieces moving in shadows, but the game was far from decided. What remained to be seen was how far Veronica would go to protect her empire, and how far I was willing to go to bring it crashing down. One thing's for sure, in a community where trust was scarce and fear was currency, Alliances mattered more than ever, and with Jennifer and a few brave neighbors at my side, I was ready to make my next move. Nothing sharpens a fight like fire. Literal fire, in my case. One early morning, I caught wind that freedom wasn't just facing bureaucratic assault anymore. While I was still digesting the latest round of absurd citations, someone decided to escalate. The dock was quiet, too quiet, when I heard the first crackle. Rushing over, I found my boat engulfed in flames, a monstrous blaze painting the night sky like some cruel sunset. You'd think electrical fire would be a rare accident, but in HOA world, it's the favorite alibi. Almost as common as their meetings and violation notices. Watching my 15 years of pride burn wasn't just heartbreaking, it was a fiery declaration. They were willing to destroy everything to keep control. But, like a phoenix, destruction often sparks rebirth. And I wasn't done yet. The fire department arrived 17 minutes later, too late to save freedom, but just in time to scribble probable electrical malfunction in the report. The smell of gasoline, the flickering shadows, the security footage showing a figure running away, none of it mattered to the official narrative. Veronica's influence was already at work, turning suspicion into silence. I filed a police report naming her and her cronies as suspects, but the detective's skepticism was thicker than smoke. Turned out the responding officer was a regular at Veronica's charity galas. Talk about a conflict of interest! The system was rigged, and justice felt like a game played with loaded dice. The absurdity was almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Between the charred remains, I found a handwritten note wedged in the rocks beside the shore. "Your dream doesn't belong here." It wasn't just vandalism, it was a threat in ink and ash. The community's reaction was a study in human nature. Some offered sympathy but whispered doubts. Others kept their distance, afraid to challenge Veronica's reign. Yet beneath the surface, conversations sparked like embers. Neighbors quietly shared stories of their own brushes with HOA wrath, confirming the pattern of intimidation and abuse. Fear was the currency here, and Veronica was the mint. But fear can only hold so long before hope, and a little courage start to burn brighter. That hope came in the form of a dusty old leather-bound journal, dropped off on my porch by Greg Wilson, a neighbor with a quiet strength. It belonged to Maplewood Cove's founding HOA president and contained forgotten bylaws, including one that granted homeowners the right to request financial audits and suspend all HOA operations if serious misconduct was proven. It was the kind of nuclear option that seemed too good to be true, yet here it was, a crack in Veronica's fortress of control. Armed with this, I reached out to my old law school friend William Anderson, a real estate attorney, who quickly became my legal anchor. Together, we began crafting a plan, knowing the road ahead would be long and hard, but finally seeing a way to turn the tide. The fight wasn't just legal, it was personal. Veronica's grip was tightening, her threats growing more blatant. During a budget meeting, I overheard her berate Linda Ramirez in a fit of rage over questioning expenses. Linda's defeated expression was a silent testament to the power Veronica wielded behind closed doors. Yet it was also a call for allies, a reminder that even the smallest voices could matter. The community was fracturing, and cracks were showing in Veronica's carefully constructed empire. As legal motions were filed and petitions drafted, I realized this battle was more than just about one man's boat. It was a fight for the soul of Maplewood Cove. Veronica's downfall hit Maplewood Cove like a thunderclap. The courtroom didn't just hold a trial, it held the final act of a drama years in the making. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of HOA power. All the accusations piled up, and Veronica, once the untouchable queen of the community, found herself stripped of her crown. Watching her shift from a confident ruler to a desperate defendant was almost surreal. The woman who dictated rules with a velvet glove now faced justice with handcuffs. It was a reminder that power built on fear and deceit is as fragile as a cracked dock plank. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. But tearing down a regime is only half the battle. What followed was the hard, honest work of rebuilding. Howard Stevens, a retired judge known for his calm demeanor and fairness, stepped up as the new HOA president. Under Howard's leadership, the atmosphere changed overnight. Meetings that had once been arenas of intimidation became spaces for open conversation and genuine listening. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Where fear had once silenced voices, now openness invited them. Howard reminded us that power shared is power sustained, a phrase that quickly became the community's new mantra. Slowly but surely, Maplewood Cove started healing. The community's healing took shape not just in meetings, but in actions. Using funds recovered from Veronica's misappropriations, residents rallied to build a new community dock. This dock wasn't just a place to tie up boats. It became a symbol, a bridge to a better future. Each plank and nail represented a commitment to transparency and shared responsibility. As neighbors worked side by side, the old divisions began to melt away. People who barely nodded to each other before started exchanging stories and laughs. It was a tangible reminder that communities aren't built on rules alone, but on connection and trust. Along with rebuilding structures came rebuilding governance. Linda Ramirez, who had once been too afraid to speak up, emerged as a strong and transparent vice president. She introduced monthly financial reports that everyone could access, no more secrets or hidden fees. Policies were rewritten to limit unchecked power and to ensure checks and balances. These reforms were practical but crucial. They transformed Maplewood Cove from a place of fear to a model of community leadership. The lessons were hard-learned, but they created a foundation strong enough to withstand future storms. Still, healing wasn't easy. The emotional wounds Veronica left behind ran deep. Many neighbors wrestled with trust and fear long after the legal battles ended. But as months passed, stories of recovery multiplied. People who had once lived in silence found their voices again. Families returned to community events, and Maplewood Cove began to feel like home once more. Watching this change was the real victory for me. Not just winning in court, but reclaiming the spirit of a neighborhood. Because in the end, standing up to corruption wasn't just about one fight. It was about building something lasting, together. The fight in Maplewood Cove didn't just end with Veronica's fall. It sparked something much bigger. Word got around, investigations spread, and state lawmakers finally sat up and took notice. New reforms rolled out across counties, strengthening homeowner protections and demanding transparency from HOAs that once operated in shadows. Suddenly, Maplewood Cove was more than a neighborhood. It was the epicenter of a movement. Watching this unfold, I realized our battle wasn't isolated. It was the first domino in a chain reaction. But it also made me wonder, will this wave of change reach every community shackled by silent fear? Or will some still be left watering weeds in a garden overrun by thorns? Homeowners across the country face battles like mine every day. Hidden agendas, unchecked power, and rules twisted to serve the few at the expense of the many. It's easy to feel small, like a single seed in a vast, uncultivated field. But gardens require care and attention. They need gardeners willing to get their hands dirty. Maplewood Cove taught me that protecting your property is about more than fences and bylaws. It's about nurturing the community itself, tending to relationships, and standing firm when the weeds try to take over. Because what does it mean to truly belong if you can't trust your neighbors or the system meant to protect you? Personally, this journey changed me in ways I never expected. I came looking for peace, but found purpose. I went from a quiet writer to someone who couldn't stay silent, not just for myself, but for everyone who felt powerless. Fighting Veronica was about reclaiming freedom in more ways than one. It was about turning fear into action, frustration into resilience. And while the scars remain, the lessons learned remind me that every loss can plant the seeds for growth. The real victory is knowing that standing up, even when the odds feel stacked, can ignite change far beyond what you imagine. And that's where you come in. This story isn't just mine. It's a call to action for anyone feeling trapped by unseen forces in their own communities. Share these lessons with friends, neighbors, anyone who needs to hear that they're not alone. Because the strength of a community lies not in silence, but in solidarity. Every voice raised, every story told is another step toward a future where HOAs serve rather than control, where gardens bloom rather than wither under neglect. The path won't always be easy, but it's a path worth walking, for freedom, for justice, and for the places we call home. So as freedom's successor, Phoenix, sails across these same waters, it carries more than sails and ropes. It carries the spirit of a community reborn, a reminder that from ashes, something stronger can rise. And as the wind fills her canvas, I'm reminded that protecting what matters, whether a boat, a home, or a community, requires courage, vigilance, and a willingness to fight for what's right. Because in the end, dreams aren't just rebuilt, they're redefined. And sometimes, the greatest victories are born from the fiercest fires. Looking back now, I realize freedom was never just a boat. It was a promise, to myself and eventually to my entire community. A promise that no one has the right to take what you've built, silence your voice, or use rules to rob you of peace. And when that promise was set on fire, I didn't walk away. I rebuilt. Not just with a new boat, but with a new belief. When people stand up together, even the most iron-fisted HOA can fall like soggy paper. This wasn't just a story about fighting a crooked board or saving a piece of property. This was a story about what happens when courage becomes contagious, about how a community, once ruled by fear, learned to speak up, stand tall, and take back what was theirs, not with fists, but with facts, unity, and purpose. If you're facing your own storm, just know, you don't need to be loud, but you do need to be steady. Because persistence beats power when people stand behind it. And maybe the best part of all, I didn't just get my life back. I got a community back. We all did. From the ashes of freedom came a stronger, wiser Maplewood Cove. And from that fire, Phoenix rose. A boat, yes, but also a symbol. A reminder that every homeowner, every neighbor, every one of us, we are not small. We are part of something bigger, and it matters how we protect it. So if this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own HOA horror story, or gave you hope that change is possible, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. A neighbor, a friend, someone standing alone who doesn't have to be. Leave a comment below. Tell us what this story meant to you, what stood out, what made you nod, laugh, or feel a little stronger. And if you want more stories like this, real, wild, powerful ones with justice, resilience, and just the right touch of HOA chaos, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Because trust me, the next story, you'll want a front row seat. And before we wrap this up, what would you like me to do next? Do you want more stories about HOA takedowns, family feuds that flip the script, or everyday folks rising up against impossible odds? Drop your ideas in the comments. Your suggestions help shape the next story, and I read every single one. The more we tell stories that matter, the more people we can reach, and the more folks realize they're not alone. So tell me, what story should we tell next?